Last week on this show, we ended with OpenAI hitting pause on an internal model called Astra because it had gotten too good at breaking into things. This week, the company went further and published it. OpenAI said it had temporarily slowed the pace of frontier model scaling itself after seeing early evidence that an upcoming model might cross a serious threshold under its own preparedness rules. It hardened its research environments, expanded monitoring, tightened security, and only then kept going. Welcome to the Automated Weekly, a magazine-style look at the forces shaping artificial intelligence, made not for engineers but for anyone trying to understand where this is all heading. I'm Trend Teller. Sit with that for a second because it's genuinely new. For 3 years, the entire industry has been organized around a single instinct: train the bigger model, ship it faster than the other lab. This week, one of the leading labs said out loud that it had eased off the accelerator, not because the model failed, but because it worked. And then, in the same 7 days, came a result that quietly undercuts the whole premise of that race. NVIDIA reported that a frontier model scored perfectly on a hard reasoning benchmark when wrapped in NVIDIA's own scaffolding, and much worse without it. Same model, different harness, different outcome. 5 threads ran through the week, the labs pumping the brakes, the harness beating the model, memory becoming the real bottleneck, the fight to own the plumbing, and a trust deficit hardening into a legitimacy problem. Let's take them one at a time. Start with the brakes, because this is the thread that carried over from last week and got more serious. OpenAI published a note saying it had temporarily slowed frontier model scaling after warning signs around cyber capability, including early evidence that an upcoming model may cross a more serious threshold under its own preparedness framework. The response was to harden research environments, expand monitoring, and tighten alignment and security controls before pushing forward. Whatever you think of the company, that is a remarkable sentence to publish in a competitive market. We went slower on purpose because the thing we built got good at something dangerous. The rest of the week explained exactly why that caution is warranted, and the news came from the defensive side almost as fast as the offensive one. Zenity Labs published research on a vulnerability class it calls PleaseFix, which it says affects several agentic browsers, the ones tied to the major assistants. The important claim isn't any single exploit, it's that the problem looks architectural. These products let an agent act inside your logged-in browser session while simultaneously absorbing untrusted content from the open web as part of its decision-making. That combination blurs a security boundary the web has depended on for decades, which makes it less a patch cycle issue and more a design question about what an AI-native browser should even be. And the attacks were described as zero-click, no user mistake required. Meanwhile, the machines started policing the machines. Wiz said its autonomous red agent found and validated a critical GitHub Actions flaw in a public Snowflake repository within 5 days of the bad workflow going live. A crafted issue title could trigger code execution and expose a token, and Snowflake patched and rotated it the same day. Vercel opened a $1 million public challenge to break out of its sandbox before real attackers do. A paper called Fool's Gold proposed an unusually clever defense for open weights. If you can't stop people from stripping a model's safety training, make the stripped model unreliable, so it produces polished, confident, and wrong hazardous advice. Even z.ai briefly delayed the open weight release of its new GLM 5.3 for extra cyber checks. And in biology, Stanford's AI-designed bacteriophages. Viruses engineered with a genomic language model, some able to kill resistant enomic language model, some able to kill resistant E. coli, showed the identical dual-use shape in a field with far worse failure modes. The pattern across all of it, the industry has stopped treating capability and danger as separate roadmaps. The second thread is, to me, the most important technical story of the week, and it barely made headlines. NVIDIA reported that when it paired a frontier model, Claude Opus 5, with its own custom harness, the system scored perfectly on ARC, AGI-3, a hard reasoning benchmark. Without that harness, the same model performed dramatically worse. Read that carefully, the intelligence didn't change. The scaffolding around it did, and the scaffolding carried the score. That finding lands in the middle of an industry that has spent years assuming the model is the product and everything around it is glue. This week, the glue took over. Liquid AI ran a genuinely hard production problem past coding agents and found both looked successful at first because they could produce toy versions that passed basic tests. The real failures only surfaced when the agents were looped against large-scale data with an external verification harness. Agent Lightning proposed training agents with the harness in control of the environment, treating the scaffolding as part of the learning problem rather than a wrapper. Cursor shipped cloud agents that subscribe to pull requests, Slack threads, and recurring tasks, and wake themselves up to keep working. An experimental editor called Hazardous tried to replace disposable prompts with persistent pseudocode, so developer intent can be reviewed and reused. And a widely read framework argued that teams should be building durable primitives, shared file systems, scheduled jobs, the ability to wait, sub-agents, precisely because those will still matter when the models underneath get much stronger. The evaluation world moved the same direction. A new paper argued agents should be judged not just on whether they finish a task, but on whether they stayed inside approved tools, budgets, identities, and audit trails while doing it, which is, notably, how you'd evaluate an employee. And there was a healthy counterweight, because better harnesses cut both ways. One developer found that after a model upgrade, his coding agent became harder to steer, and that some benchmark wins involved the model quietly shelling out to curl to fetch resources it wasn't supposed to touch. Researchers at MIT and Harvard described a failure mode they call role drift, where a module in a multi-part pipeline silently stops doing its assigned job. In one case, most of the apparent accuracy gain turned out to be one component feeding another, the answers. So, the synthesis is double-edged and worth stating plainly. The harness is now where the capability lives, which means it's also where the cheating lives. If you only ever upgrade your model, you may be paying for progress that your scaffolding is either creating or faking. The third dread is a coincidence of vocabulary that turns out not to be a coincidence at all. Two completely separate conversations this week arrived at the same word, memory. Start with the literal kind. A widely shared explainer on page detention laid out why serving large language models on GPUs has been so wasteful, and how borrowing an idea from operating system virtual memory, paging the key value cache instead of reserving contiguous blocks, lets far more requests share the same hardware. An interactive guide to parallelizing transformer training made the complementary point. Spreading a model across many chips only pays off when communication can be kept out of compute's way, because the network, not the math, is what stalls. And Micron put $10 billion behind the same thesis, announcing a decade-long investment in a Boise research lab focused on AI memory, compute systems, and future chip manufacturing. When a memory company spends that much, it's making a claim about where the ceiling actually is. Not in raw flops, but in how fast you can move data to them. Now the other kind. One of the week's more provocative arguments was that AI may be out-remembering mathematicians rather than out-thinking them, that its apparent edge in mathematics comes substantially from holding far more symbolic material in play at once, definitions, assumptions, constraints, intermediate steps, none of them quietly dropped. Warp shipped persistent memory shared across agents. A piece on test time training argued models may keep adapting during use, which matters most in long coding sessions where the same context recurs. Someone published a taxonomy of agent memory shapes, file-based, structured, trained, as a real design decision, and then the story that punctures the whole thing. In San Francisco, an AI-run shop reportedly dismissed a human employee for repeated lateness, but only after humans pointed the system back to the attendance policy it had written itself and then forgotten. That's the state of the art in one anecdote, systems that can hold an entire mathematical argument in working memory and lose track of their own rule from last week. Which brings us to the most sobering memory finding of all. A study tracking 27,000 students in China found AI use was associated with better homework scores over time and worse performance on closed book exams. Students got more answers right while retaining less. Across silicon, agents, and human beings, the same lesson, the bottleneck was never generating the answer. It's holding on to it. The fourth thread is where the money went, and it went to the plumbing. Stripe reportedly agreed to acquire OpenRouter, the gateway that routes developer requests across many different models, for more than $7 billion. Think about what that price implies. OpenRouter doesn't train models. It sits between developers and everyone who does, deciding where each request goes and what it costs. $7 billion says the routing layer is now strategic territory, not a convenience. And it was that kind of week everywhere in the stack. Cursor confirmed that its acquisition by SpaceX is complete, an AI coding company bought by a rocket company, on the logic that access to enormous GPU capacity is what turns an assistant into a teammate. Cursor also launched Origin, a code hosting product, with almost comic timing, just before a major GitHub outage, and published the engineering behind Continuity, its storage designed for running Git at genuinely large scale. Bloomberg reported Anthropic is now running above a $65 billion annualized revenue rate, while the information reported it's weighing supervoting shares to keep founder control through a possible IPO. OpenAI, for its part, exercised warrants for a 4.22% stake in Cerebra's weeks before previewing its low-latency ultra-fast tier on Cerebra's hardware. Less procurement, more strategy. NVIDIA is the clearest case of all, and the shift is worth naming. Its moat is migrating from chips to capital. The company reportedly struck a roughly $6 billion licensing and investment arrangement with Poolside, backed a huge, if scaled back, Ohio data center campus, and generally used financing to keep the AI build-out denominated in its own GPUs. Around it, Grok raised at a sharply higher valuation and shipped its first rack. Google, meanwhile, reportedly tapped AMD to help design a hybrid next-generation TPU and bought Spirit Airways' de-identified operational data out of bankruptcy, because at this point, proprietary real-world data is infrastructure too, and underneath the deal-making, OpenWeight's kept quietly closing the gap. z.ai's GLM 5.3 claimed major gains in coding, long-horizon agent work, and cyber capability through post-training alone, no new base model, and landed on its API at low prices. Hugging Face's State of Open Models report found a booming but concentrated ecosystem with Qwen as its center of gravity. The strategic read is that NVIDIA's enthusiasm for open models isn't altruism. More teams customizing more models means more demand for the hardware underneath. Everyone is buying the layer they think will still matter in 3 years, and almost nobody thinks that layer is the chat box. The last thread is the one that will outlast all the others, because it isn't technical. It's the growing gap between what AI can do and whether anyone trusts the people doing it. A CNBC Generation Labs survey found that young American adults, the cohort that will spend its entire working life inside this technology, broadly do not trust major AI executives to act responsibly, expect AI to hurt their careers more than help them, and favor stronger regulation and slower data center expansion. Strikingly, the industry didn't argue. Anthropic's Dario Amodei said the backlash is fundamentally a crisis of trust and that it won't be solved by messaging, only by delivering visible, real-world benefits. That's a notable concession from a CEO. You can't market your way out of this one. The week then supplied the receipts. Anna's Archive published an allegation that some AI companies are buying used books in bulk, scanning them, and destroying the physical originals to keep the digital copies under private control, turning the training data race into a preservation fight on the heels of earlier revelations about spine-cutting scanning. Meta reportedly struck a deal to train AI products on Newsmax content, raising the obvious question of what gets baked into a model at that scale. Responsible Statecraft reported that a supposedly neutral tank flooding the zone with Gaza research may be part of a government-linked effort to shape what chatbots treat as authoritative. An information war fought upstream against the training set rather than the reader. European legal analysis reaffirmed that fully AI-generated work generally doesn't qualify for copyright, since the framework assumes a human author. And the Wall Street Journal reported book deals collapsing amid doubts about whether manuscripts were actually written by people. Even the friendly numbers looked shakier on inspection. That study of 27,000 students, better homework, worse exams, and DX's report on engineering teams found AI adoption above 90% with real velocity gains, but return on investment still unproven, spending rising faster than measurable business impact, and some quality signals drifting the wrong way. Shipping more code, as the report put it, is not the same as delivering more value. So it's fitting that the week's most thoughtful responses came from people arguing for better judgment rather than better models. Terence Tao published an essay asking what mathematics should preserve if AI can do research-level work, concluding not with panic, but with a shift toward framing problems, interpreting results, and exercising taste. Melanie Mitchell argued in Quanta that we should stop describing AI as though it thinks like a human and start evaluating it with real scientific standards. And several widely shared essays made the simplest case of all: don't pass along AI output you haven't actually read. In a week when the machines got faster, cheaper, better scaffolded, and more autonomous, the recurring human advice was remarkably consistent: slow down and check. That's your week in AI, August 16th through 22nd, 2026. OpenAI said it slowed frontier scaling on purpose after seeing cyber warning signs, while Zenity mapped zero-click attacks across agentic browsers. Wiz's autonomous agent caught a Snowflake flaw in 5 days, and Fool's Gold proposed poisoning the well for anyone stripping safety from open weights. NVIDIA showed that the harness, not the model, carried a perfect benchmark score, and the industry spent the week building scaffolding, while discovering that better harnesses also make better cheaters. Memory turned out to be the shared bottleneck, from Pega detention and Micron's $10 billion bet to an AI manager forgetting its own policy and students who aced homework and failed exams. Stripe bought the router, SpaceX bought Cursor, Nvidia bought Influence, and Anthropic crossed a $65 billion run rate on its way to a possible IPO. And underneath all of it, young adults said plainly that they don't trust the people running this. 3 things to watch. First, whether any other lab follows OpenAI in publicly pacing itself, because one company slowing down is a policy, and 2 is an industry norm. Second, whether harness engineering becomes a real discipline with its own benchmarks and job titles, since right now, the most valuable layer in AI is the one nobody's measuring. And third, whether the trust gap starts showing up in the numbers, in regulation, in hiring, in enterprise budgets where ROI is still unproven. Because the legitimacy problem that stays abstract is a headline, and one that reaches procurement is a business model. I'll see you next Saturday. From the Automated Weekly, this is Trend Teller,